In the quiet town of Pinewood, nestled deep in the forests of New England, there was a place known to the locals as the Old Pine Cemetery. It was a graveyard that had been forgotten by time, yet it was infamous for its dark and eerie reputation. The cemetery was surrounded by thick trees, their branches twisted like skeletal hands reaching towards the sky. The tombstones were old, many with names worn away by years of neglect, and the gates creaked like they had a voice of their own, protesting any attempt to enter. The locals spoke little of it. Parents would warn their children to stay away from the cemetery, especially after sunset, when the air became thick with an unnatural chill. The whispers of ghosts, restless spirits, and unholy rites that had once taken place within the cemetery's boundaries circulated through the town, but no one dared go near it. The stories varied. Some claimed the spirits of those who had died in tragic ways still walked the earth, searching for release. Others spoke of a curse that had haunted the cemetery for centuries, a curse placed by a powerful sorcerer whose ritual had gone terribly wrong. Most of these stories were seen as nothing more than folklore, a way to scare the younger generation into behaving. However, for 5 college friends, Jake, Emma, Mark, Lily, and Noah, the thrill of discovering the truth behind these rumors was too tempting to resist. One evening, during the fall semester of their senior year, the group gathered at their dorm room, exchanging stories about the scariest places they had visited. Emma, ever the curious one, brought up the subject of the cemetery. "You know," she began, "I've heard that people who visit that cemetery after dark sometimes see strange lights or hear whispers calling their names. I bet it's all just a legend, though." Jake, always the skeptic, laughed it off. "Oh, come on. You know it's just another ghost story. There's no such thing as haunted places." Mark, who was never one to back down from a challenge, raised an eyebrow. "What if it's true? What if the cemetery really is haunted? I mean, think about it. It's old, creepy, and practically untouched by modern life. Wouldn't it be amazing to spend the night there and figure out what's really going on?" Lily, a bit hesitant but intrigued by the idea, spoke up. "I'm in if you guys are, but only if we promise to leave by dawn. I don't like the idea of being stuck there after sunrise." Noah nodded. "I'm in too, but we need to be careful. I've heard the stories. I don't want to tempt fate." The group agreed to go, planning to arrive at the cemetery just before midnight, spend an hour exploring, and return before first light. They thought it would be a harmless adventure, a bit of fun to pass the time before exams and deadlines piled up. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light over the forest as the friends made their way to the cemetery. The path was narrow and overgrown with weeds, and the air had a strange weight to it, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. The wind seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. When they finally reached the cemetery gates, the rusted hinges creaked loudly, protesting their entry. The large iron gates were half open, as if inviting them in. Emma, who had been the most excited about the trip, led the way as they stepped past the gates and into the graveyard. The cemetery was even more unsettling up close. The tombstones were crooked and worn, some leaning dangerously, others almost buried beneath vines and moss. The ground was uneven and the trees seemed to loom overhead, their bare branches like twisted fingers stretching across the sky. The air felt unnaturally cold, even though it was late autumn, and the night should have been crisp but clear. "Let's sit down over there," Lily suggested, pointing to an old bench beneath a large oak tree. "It'll be good to rest for a bit." The friends sat down, trying to make light of the creepy atmosphere by telling jokes and laughing nervously. Mark pulled out his phone, hoping to take some pictures, but the screen flickered strangely. Guys? Is it just me, or is the signal completely dead out here?" Noah frowned, checking his phone. "Same here. Weird." For a while they sat in uneasy silence, listening to the sounds of the night. There was a low rustling in the trees, but it was hard to tell whether it was the wind or something else. The moonlight bathed the cemetery in a ghostly glow, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching like dark tendrils across the ground. As the clock struck 12, an eerie wind began to howl through the trees. The atmosphere in the cemetery shifted. It felt as though the very air around them was thickening, like they were being suffocated by something unseen. The temperature dropped and they shivered, even though none of them could explain why. It was then that Jake heard it, a faint whisper, almost too quiet to hear. It sounded like his name. He looked around, saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Jake, stop messing around," Emma said, laughing nervously. But Jake wasn't laughing. He stood up and looked around, his heart racing. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Jake, what the hell is that?" Mark asked, standing up as well. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice tight, "but it's coming from over there." He pointed toward the far end of the cemetery where the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The group followed his gaze, and at first they saw nothing. But then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared. At first it was just a shape, tall and gaunt, its outline blurry against the moonlit fog. But as it stepped closer, they could make out its features: pale skin, a hollow eyes, and a mouth twisted into an expression of eternal sorrow. The figure was floating just above the ground, gliding silently toward them. Emma gasped, "Is that a ghost?" The figure stopped in front of them, and the air grew even colder. Its eyes locked onto theirs, and in that moment they felt a chilling sense of dread wash over them. "What are you doing here?" the figure asked, its voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. "This is not a place for the living." None of them could move. It was as if their bodies were frozen, held captive by the figure's presence. Mark tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his voice failed him. We didn't mean any harm," Jake stammered, his voice trembling. The figure's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You have disturbed the dead," it hissed. "You cannot leave now." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet cracked open with a loud rumble. From the earth, more figures emerged, twisted shapes, their eyes glowing with an eerie red light. They were the souls of those who had died under mysterious circumstances, their forms barely human, their faces distorted with anger and pain. They reached out, their hands like claws, and the group realized they were surrounded. Lily screamed, and Noah tried to pull her away, but his feet were rooted to the spot. Emma turned to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if an invisible force was keeping them in place, ensuring that they couldn't escape. A cold wind howled through the cemetery, and the shadows seemed to come alive. The figures closed in on them, their hollow eyes filled with a hunger that chilled them to the bone. The air was thick with the scent of death, and it felt as though the very ground beneath them was swallowing them whole. "We have to get out of here," Mark cried, his voice panicked. But it was too late. The spirits reached out with their skeletal hands, their fingers brushing against the friend's skin. It felt like ice, freezing them to the core. And just as the spirits were about to claim them, a new voice echoed through the air. "Leave them be." A figure appeared from the darkness, her presence calming yet powerful. She was an old woman, her face kind but marked with sorrow. She stepped forward, her hands raised, and the spirits hesitated. The woman spoke words in a language the group didn't understand, but as she did, the spirits slowly began to withdraw, their forms fading back into the earth. "Go now," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "This place is cursed, and you have disturbed it. Leave and never return." The group, shaking and terrified, didn't need to be told twice. They turned and fled from the cemetery, their hearts pounding, their minds racing with fear. The figure of the old woman watched them leave, her sad eyes following them as they disappeared into the night. The next few days were a blur for Jake and his friends. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the curse of the cemetery had followed them home. Strange things began to happen. Lily woke up in the middle of the night to hear whispers in her room, calling her name. Mark found shadows lurking at the edge of his vision, disappearing when he turned to look. Emma dreamed of the cemetery, walking among the gravestones, unable to find her way out. Jake felt an invisible presence watching him wherever he went. And Noah saw flickering lights outside his window at odd hours, like will-o'-the-wisp moving through the trees. It was as though the spirits of the cemetery were still out there, waiting for something. Waiting for them. Jake, feeling a desperate need to understand what had happened, decided to return to the cemetery alone. His friends tried to stop him, warning him that he might never come back, but Jake was determined. The spirits had marked them, and he needed answers. That night, he returned to the cemetery just as the clock struck midnight. The air was still and thick with fog, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the graveyard. The cemetery seemed unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But Jake could feel the presence of the spirits, like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He walked to the spot where they had sat earlier, and as he did, the ground began to tremble. The spirits appeared once more, their faces twisted in rage, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. Jake stood tall and faced them. "I know you're angry," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm here to help you. You don't have to suffer anymore." The spirits paused, and for a moment everything was still. Then the old woman appeared again, stepping from the shadows. She nodded at Jake, her expression filled with gratitude. "You've come to free them," she said softly. "But the curse of this place is not so easily broken." Jake stepped forward. "I'll do whatever it takes. Tell me what I need to do." The woman gestured to a nearby tombstone, its inscription worn away by time. The curse was placed here long ago by a sorcerer, a powerful one, who used dark magic to trap the spirits in this cemetery. His ritual went wrong, and now the souls are bound here, unable to find peace. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of the task before him. "How do I stop it?" The woman's eyes darkened. "You must perform a ritual to break the curse. Only then will the souls be free. But be warned, the ritual requires great sacrifice." Jake spent the next few days researching the old sorcerer and his dark magic. He found a book hidden in the town library, a book that contained the ritual he needed to perform to free the spirits. The ritual was complex, and it required rare ingredients and the right timing. But Jake was determined to succeed. On the night of the ritual, Jake returned to the cemetery with the old book in hand. The air was heavy with anticipation as he stood in the center of the graveyard, preparing the altar with candles and offerings. The spirits began to gather around him, their hollow eyes watching his every move. He began chanting the incantation from the book, his voice trembling but resolute. The ground shook beneath him, and the wind howled through the trees. The spirits reached out to him, their faces twisted in anguish, but Jake did not falter. As he completed the chant, a burst of light erupted from the earth, and the spirits screamed in agony. But then, something changed. The light grew brighter, and the spirits began to dissolve, their twisted forms fading into the mist. The cemetery grew silent. Jake fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. The curse had been broken. The spirits were finally free. But even as the cemetery became still, Jake knew that he had made a sacrifice. The darkness that had once haunted Pinewood was gone, but the memories of the spirits would live on in his heart forever. And as Jake left the cemetery for the final time, he knew that the stories of the haunted graveyard would never truly fade. The spirits would always remain, waiting for the next soul who dared to uncover their secrets. As the last of the spirits dissolved into the air, a strange peace settled over the cemetery. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted Pinewood for generations seemed to lift. The wind, once icy and unwelcoming, was now calm, and the trees no longer seemed like twisted figures reaching for the sky. The cemetery, which had long been a place of dread, now felt still. The curse was broken. Jake remained kneeling on the ground, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His mind raced, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The ritual had worked, but at a price. He was certain that a piece of his soul had been left behind in the cemetery, an invisible thread tying him to the spirits he had just helped release. As Jake stood up, the old woman's spirit appeared before him once again. Her face was kind but filled with sorrow, as though she too carried the weight of centuries of suffering. She looked at him with deep appreciation, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet sadness that only he could understand now. "You've done it, Jake," she said softly. "You have freed the souls, but remember, nothing ever truly ends. You have lifted the curse, but the memories will remain with you." Jake nodded, unable to speak. He had known this wasn't just about ending a haunting. It was about understanding the pain that lingered in the world, even after death. "You will not forget what you've done here," the woman continued. "The peace you've earned for the souls is also the peace you've earned for yourself. But know this, sometimes the echoes of such experiences will always remain. Not all of them fade." With that, her form shimmered and dissolved into the night air. The cemetery had fallen silent, and Jake knew that his journey was far from over. The days following the ritual felt surreal to Jake. The town of Pinewood began to shift, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The cemetery was no longer the feared and cursed place it once was. People who had avoided it now walked by it with a sense of reverence rather than dread. Some even stopped to leave flowers or silently pay respects to the souls that had been liberated. Jake found himself haunted by strange dreams, however. Every night, he would close his eyes only to find himself standing in the middle of the cemetery, surrounded by the mist and the quiet whispers of the spirits. Sometimes he would see their faces, grateful yet distant, as if they were reminding him that he had fulfilled his purpose but could never truly escape the consequences. He visited the cemetery one last time, during the first light of dawn, just before the town woke up. Standing at the entrance, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. The place that had once felt so ominous and suffocating now seemed still, almost sacred. The trees were no longer twisted, but rather, they stood as silent sentinels over the resting place of the souls who had found their way to peace. "I did it," Jake whispered to himself. "They're free." But a part of him, a part that couldn't be shaken, knew that his connection to them would never truly end. He had been a bridge between the living and the dead, and in doing so, he had changed forever. Jake's friends, who had been worried about him, eventually came to understand the weight of what he had done. They had felt the after effects of the curse too, and although they had not experienced the same deep connection to the spirits, they knew that the cemetery would forever remain a part of their lives. Lily was the first to speak to him about it. She had been the most fearful during their initial visit, but she now saw Jake with new eyes. Eyes that understood both fear and courage. The kind that comes with facing something far bigger than oneself. "I still hear their voices sometimes," she admitted one evening, sitting beside him on the porch of his house, watching the sun set. "But I don't feel afraid anymore. I think we're all connected, somehow. In a way, you freed all of us." Jake gave her a sad, knowing smile. "Yeah, I think so too." Mark too came to terms with the events. The once skeptic had seen the truth with his own eyes and had learned that some things can't be explained by science alone. And although he had no desire to return to the cemetery, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for what Jake had accomplished. Noah, who had heard the whispers calling his name for days after their visit, was finally able to let go. He had been the most reluctant to return to the cemetery, but seeing Jake finally make peace with the spirits gave him the closure he had desperately needed. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to normal. Jake tried to continue with his studies, but a part of him would always be drawn back to the cemetery. He had learned that some journeys don't end with the closing of a door. They leave an imprint on your soul, an imprint that will last long after you think you've moved on. One day, while browsing through old books in the town library, Jake came across a dusty, forgotten tome about Pinewood and its history. He flipped through the pages until he found an old account of a sorcerer who had once lived in the town centuries ago. The sorcerer had been obsessed with immortality and had conducted forbidden rituals to trap the souls of the dead, trying to manipulate the forces of life and death. It was then that Jake realized the truth. This wasn't just a random haunting. The cemetery had been a battleground for centuries, and the sorcerer's curse was never meant to be lifted. But Jake had done it. He had broken the curse. Now, as he stood in front of the library's window, looking out at the distant cemetery, he knew that the town of Pinewood would never be the same again. He had released the souls. He had freed the spirits of the forgotten dead. And in doing so, he had freed himself. Years later, Jake returned to the cemetery, now a peaceful park where the town gathered for quiet moments of reflection. The shadows that once loomed menacingly over the land had long since vanished. In the heart of the cemetery stood a memorial, a stone tablet engraved with the names of the souls who had been freed. A plaque read, "To those who suffered in silence, may they rest in peace." Jake smiled softly as he read the inscription, his fingers tracing the cold stone. His journey had been long, filled with darkness and light, but in the end, he had found peace. The cemetery, no longer a place of fear, had become a symbol of understanding and redemption. And Jake knew that the souls he had helped liberate would never truly leave him. They had become a part of him, just as he had become a part of their story. As he walked away from the cemetery, a gust of wind blew softly behind him. Jake paused for a moment and glanced over his shoulder, knowing that the spirits were still there, watching over the land, content and at peace. And with that, he continued down the path, knowing that life was a delicate balance between light and darkness, between the living and the dead. But if one had the courage to face it all, they could find their way to the light, just as he had. Forever changed, but stronger for it.